So why would we study the life of Moses? We might think it's be a whole lot more important to study the life of Jesus. And yet, there's something in Moses that leads us to Jesus. This is not on your outline. You might want to write that down. Acts chapter 7, verse 35 through 37 will explain what I just said. This Moses, whom they disowned, saying, "Who made you a ruler or a judge?" is the one whom God sent to be both a ruler and a deliverer with the help of the angel who appeared to him in the thorn bush. This man led them out, performing wonders and signs in the land of Egypt and in the Red Sea and in the wilderness for 40 years. This is the Moses who said to the sons of Israel, "God shall raise up for you a prophet like me for your brethren." Well, who was that prophet like Moses? Well, it was Jesus. He didn't use the word Messiah there because the word Messiah doesn't appear in our Bibles until the book of Daniel. Then all of a sudden they begin to call the promised one the Christ or the Messiah. At that point in time, the best way that they explained somebody that was sent from God to accomplish and say the things of God was to call him a prophet. And it says of him, he would be both a ruler and a deliverer. A ruler and a deliverer. King Jesus, who delivered us from our sin. That's why we study the life of Moses. And throughout this book of Exodus, you're going to find many, many things that absolutely point us to how we handle life here on this earth. Because Moses went through some of the same struggles that all of us go through in our relationship here on the earth. Moses' life can be divided into 3 40-year periods. His first 40 years was spent in Egypt. His second 40 years was spent in the wilderness where he was a shepherd. And his last 40 years was spent in the desert leading the children of Israel out of Egypt and toward the promised land until God finally closed his eyes in death. And so we have an understanding that he would change the course of a nation, the nation of Israel, and also the whole world. Because today, we are involved in the very things that Moses began by God using him to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt. You know, I was looking at David and Moses and thinking, which one of them was mentioned more in the New Testament? In my mind, I figured it was David. You know, the book of Psalms and all the things. But David is only mentioned 58 times in the New Testament, whereas Moses is mentioned 79 times in the New Testament. And so we have this understanding of the importance and the impact that he makes on all of us today. Back in Exodus, in chapter 1, we see that Jacob's family, there were 70 people that came from the promised land to Egypt when Joseph was ruler there. Look in verse 5 for a second. And all the persons who came from the loins of Jacob were 70 in number, but Joseph was already in Egypt. And so when they left, just think about this, 70 people went into Egypt, and then Jacob's family of 4, or Joseph's family of 4. When they left, 400 years later, over 2 million during that 400-year time period. Now, it's important, and we're even going to look at that in just a little bit as to why that's important. And so it took over 400 years for God to keep His promise. But He did not fail. He did not fail. We're going to first look at the background of Moses becoming God's servant. How did that happen? He started out thinking that he was going to be used by God. And then after killing the Egyptian, that went away and he went into seclusion. He thought his ability to be used by God was over. And God said, "No, I'm not done with you yet." And so God raised him up to do greater things. Exodus, meaning departing, starts after the life of Joseph, the end of the book of Genesis. Joseph ruled in Egypt for about 70 years. Then for another 100 years, Israel enjoyed the prominence in Egypt, and they were blessed, and they had the land to themselves. Everything was going well until a new king shows up in Egypt that didn't know who Joseph was. Look in verse 8. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and in the event of war they also join themselves to those who hate us and fight against us and depart from the land." Now Pharaoh had a lot going here, because over the time they went from taking care of the livestock in Egypt. Pharaoh under Joseph said, if they'll take care of the livestock, we'll let them live in the land. And that's what they did. But as time went on, the Egyptians began to put more and more on them until about 100 years later, they're in full-bore slavehood. They're slaves. And Pharaoh doesn't want to lose his workforce. He wants to hang on to him. And so he says, we got to do something about this, because they're mightier and more than we are. What are we going to do? Well, let's read on in verse 11, and we see his plan. So they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor, and they built for Pharaoh story sitters in Pithom and Ramesses. And the more they afflicted him, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out, so that they were a dread in the land of Israel, or the sons of Israel. And the Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to hard, rigorous labor. His plan was, let's wear them out so they don't have time to make babies. Let's just physically exhaust them. Well, God overran that, and God made it to where they continued to propagate. They continued to multiply over and over. And so all of a sudden he has to go to plan B. What's he going to do now to stop this? Well, if you look down there in verse 15, then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other was named Puah, and he said, "When you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth, see to them and sit upon the footstool, birth stool. It is a son, and if it's a son, then you shall put him to death. But if it's a daughter, he shall live." What his plan was, just as soon as the baby is born, before it ever has an opportunity to cry, just suffocate it. And just say, "Oh, I'm sorry, your baby was stillborn." That was his plan. That didn't work. His plan did not work. Why? Look in verse 17. This is really an amazing verse. But the midwives feared God. why would they fear God, the God of heaven, the God of Israel? They had multiple gods. When we get down to when they're ready to leave and the 10 plagues, every one of those plagues represented a god for Egypt. They had all those gods that they worshiped. Why would they fear God? I think there's only one answer to that. They were living among the Israelites, helping with the birth of the children. They watched those families. They saw their dedication. They saw them cry out to God, and they were moved by the dedication that these people had for God, and they feared God as a result of watching Israel. You know, that's exactly what God has called on us to do. Let your light so shine before men that they'll see your good works and glorify God. That's all it takes. That's all it takes for us to show the world that there is a God who loves them and can save them through watching our lives. Well, because they feared God, they didn't kill the boys. So guess what? They're continuing to grow in number. Verse 18. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives, and he said to them, "Why have you done this thing? And let the boys live." And the midwives said to Pharaoh, now, they feared God, but they're getting ready to tell a lie. I don't know how you deal with that, okay? We're just going to have to leave that to God. Because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and they give birth before the midwife can get to them. So God was good to the midwives. And the people multiplied and became very mighty. And it came about because the midwives feared God that He, God, established households for them. Well, that didn't work either. And so now, Pharaoh resorts to the ultimate plan: just kill the babies. Kill all the boys. Look in verse 21, 22. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, his army. He isn't leaving it up to the midwives any longer. Every son who is born, you're to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. I mean, that just grates at you, doesn't it, to know that they would go house to house. They would search out a baby, whether he was a day old, a week old, a month old, or a year old. They'd take him down to the Nile where the crocodiles lived and throw him in for crocodile feed. Can you imagine? America is guilty. We're guilty of murdering innocent babies. Do we fear God? Do we fear God? Lessons to be learned from this. Life's hardships don't erase God's promises. I don't know what you're going through. I suspect every one of us, if we gave you an opportunity in front of the mic, every one of you could tell us something that's going on in your life that you wish would stop, change, or get better. It's just what this life is. There's always problems. There's always hardships. There's always things that hurt. And we have got to understand that God didn't forsake us. God isn't deaf to our cries and our prayers, but that God is going to keep His promise. He will absolutely make sure that we are taken care of. Israel had been promised by God that they would return to the promised land. They wouldn't always be slaves in Egypt. Let me read it to you from Genesis chapter 15, beginning in verse 13. And God said to Abram, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions." God is going to bring them out. But why 400 years? Couldn't He have caused them to exit 10 years later? Couldn't God have done that? Shake your head, yes. Sure He could. He chose not to. Why? Why the 400 years? I think there's a couple of physical explanations, and then there's one that we have to just trust God on. Isaiah chapter 55, verses 8 and 9. "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, and my ways are not your ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Who among us can outthink God?" Pretty silent, huh? Who among us always knows what God's doing? We've got to trust God. It just boils down to trust God. He does know what He's doing. He does have a plan. It may not look to you right now, but God is a God of keeping His promises, and He will not forsake you. He will not allow you to go out of His will if you remain faithful and you trust Him. A couple of physical reasons. 10 years later, those 70 people may have been 140. It could have been about that many. They would have been incapable of going into the promised land with 140 people, with only a third of them being soldiers, and wiping out all of the Canaanite and all the inhabitants of the promised land. They couldn't have done it. They needed to grow. They needed to have more so that there was a healthy army that was able to go into the land. The second thing is that the land of Palestine, if they'd have taken 140 people into Palestine, you'd only put about one person every 100 square miles. There would have been no way that they could have existed in all of the land of Palestine with that few of people. God needed the nation to grow. But bottom line, and never forget, God had a plan that's far beyond anything that you and I will ever be able to come up with. We can have our little minuscule human understandings that I just gave you, but there was something that God knew that we won't know until we get there, if we care to ask at that point. And so, why the 400 years? Only God knows. But God's timing is always perfect. He's never early. He's never late. I've thought that a time or two in my life. God, how come you're not speeding this up? I expect you have too. How come this is continuing to go on? Lord, why? I think Galatians 4:4 answers it for us. It says, "In the fullness of time, God sent forth His Son into the world, born of a woman, born under the law." In the fullness of time. I don't have time to go into it, but there were several things at that specific time, at the birth of Jesus, that all came together that made it the perfect time for God to send the Messiah into the world. God knew what he was doing. He could have sent Jesus right after Abraham. But instead he chose this specific time about 2,000 years ago to send his son into the world. And again, we can have our little human understandings, but the greatest understanding is God had the perfect plan. And we've got to trust him on that. And God hears our cries for help. God hears when we're going through the misery of life. Listen to this from Exodus chapter 3 that we're going to get to in a few weeks, verses 7 and 9. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings. So I have come down to deliver them out of the power of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from the land, to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to a place where the Canaanite, the Hivite, the Amorite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite. God hears our prayers, and he's got a perfect answer for it. And it may not look like the perfect answer to you. Over in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7, it says this, cast all your cares upon him, because he cares for you. Never doubt that. The devil is trying to get you to doubt God's love, to doubt that God hears your prayers, to doubt that God even cares about the difficulties that you're going through. The devil wants you to doubt God. And don't do it. You can cry out and you can say, I don't understand, but always end that prayer with, God, I still trust you in whatever you're doing and however you want to do it. Over the course of the book of Exodus, I'm using a commentary that was written by Chuck Swindoll. You do well to buy the book and read it, because I'm not going to get to everything he says, and it's good stuff. But there's a quote in there that I want to give you that just says perfectly what I'm just trying to get across. Listen. God is always aware and cares deeply. He will do whatever it takes to rescue his people. His deliverance may not arrive on your timetable or in the manner in which you expect it, but it will arrive at the best time, and he will not abandon his own. Amen? Don't forget that. I don't know what you're going through right now, but I can tell you, God cares, God hears, and in the perfect time, and in the exact perfect way, he'll care for you. Hardships are allowed by God because they have a purpose. In James chapter 1, verse 2, count it all joy, my brethren, when you fall into manifold trials and temptations, knowing that it'll prove your faith, and let it have its perfect work, that you might be complete, lacking in nothing. That's what comes out of difficulties. God fulfilling everything in your life that you need, lacking nothing. When you're going through those hardships of life, you can always say, good's a-coming. I don't know what it is yet, but it's coming. God made you a promise. God said He will always turn it into good. Romans 8:28. Yeah, we know that He is going to turn the evil into something good in our lives. It isn't good that happens, it's evil that happens. But God says, I can take that evil and I can recreate that evil, and from that evil, there's going to be something good that happens in your life. What an amazing understanding. He will always be with us. You remember when the angel appeared to Joseph when Mary was pregnant with Jesus and Joseph was going to divorce her? The angel appeared and said, don't do that. What's in her is from the Holy Spirit. And he quotes an Old Testament prophet, and he says, you will call his name Emmanuel, God with us. Say it with me. God with us. That's not temporary. That's not off and on. That's continual. God with us. Romans chapter 8, verse 31 says, if God be for us, who can be against us? He says, we win. Hang on. We win. The hardships are only going to produce in you the thing that's going to help you be a winner. And then He uses it to help us forsake sin. Sometimes God allows the hardships of life to remind us there's things that need to change. There's things that have a grip on your life that you need to let go. There's things that are becoming more important to you than your relationship with God. And the hardship creates an understanding of that so that we can remedy that and change our lives. Listen to this from 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 1. Therefore, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same purpose, because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. I don't know about you. I have a real desire not to sin. I have a real desire to live my life in the holiness of God. And sometimes I let the human nature take over. And I need this earthly suffering to remind me, get those things out of your life and live a life that pleases God. It's also the understanding that God is preparing to use us. I love the end of Joseph's life after his dad Jacob dies and the other 11 sons are all scared to death that now Joseph's going to take it out on us. He's going to get revenge. And back in Genesis chapter 50, he has one of the greatest understandings that you and I need to grab a hold of today. In chapter 50 and verse 20, he explains what's going on this way. As for you, his brothers, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result to preserve many people alive. God meant it for good. And you know what? It'll always be good unless you give up. If you quit, then it won't come true. But if you remain faithful, God will use it for good. Listen to this, another quote from Swindoll. Yes, you may feel unqualified, uneducated, untrained, undergifted, or even unworthy. Yet those are excellent qualifications for God to do a mighty work if we don't quit. If we don't quit. The greatest understanding is that ultimately God has a reward for those that remain faithful. Over in John chapter 5, he explains what that looks like in the resurrection that's to come after our death. Verse 28, do not marvel at this, for the hour is coming in which all who are in the tombs shall hear his voice and shall come forth. Those who did good deeds to a resurrection of life, and those who committed evil deeds to a resurrection of judgment. Hang on. The goods are coming. Hang on. Resurrection day will arrive. And it'll be just in time. Let's pray.